Hey pizza chefs, first we will do a direct mix. We'll measure out the flour. You can use flour with 12%, 13%, or 14% protein when doing a direct mix. It doesn't have to be the strongest protein flour. We'll use this one with 14% protein. We're using the finest Italian type 00 flour, and we will make a mix with 3 kilograms of flour. Sift the flour to incorporate air. The ideal storage temperature for flour is around 20 degrees Celsius. Pour all 3 kilograms of flour into the mixer. Then measure the yeast. We use fresh yeast, and we'll add 3 grams per kilogram of flour. Since we have 3 kilograms of flour, we'll add 9 grams of fresh yeast. I prefer using fresh yeast. If someone uses dry yeast, they'll add 1 gram per kilogram of flour. First, put ice in the bowl. We have 3 kilograms of flour here, and we'll add about 400 to 450 grams of ice. Now add the water. Aim for 75% hydration, meaning 750 grams of water per 1 kilogram of flour. Since we have 3 kilograms of flour, we need 2 kilograms and 250 grams of water. Take a ladle and mix it to cool down all the water. It's very important that the final mix temperature doesn't exceed 24 degrees Celsius. Especially in summer, ideally, it should be up to 20 degrees Celsius. Ideal temperatures are between 17 and 20 degrees Celsius since we'll be able to control the dough much more easily. Now, transfer the excess water into another bowl. We'll leave 1740 grams, which is 58% per kilogram. So, 580 grams of water per 1 kilogram of flour. We have 3 kilograms of flour. 3 times 580 equals 1,740. This means we'll start with 58% hydration. The next step is to measure out the salt and olive oil. We'll add 75 grams of salt, which is 25 grams per kilogram of flour. With salt, a gram more or less isn't a problem, but precision with yeast is crucial. 1 gram when measuring yeast is a significant difference. Next, measure the olive oil. Add 20 grams per kilogram. We have 3 kilograms of flour, so add 60 grams of olive oil. As with salt, a gram more or less isn't a problem. Now that we've measured everything, start mixing. My colleague Strahinol first add the yeast. Crumble it a bit. Turn on the mixer to the first speed, just to mix the yeast and flour a little. Next, add the water. We'll add those 1740 grams, that's 58%. This means we're starting with 58% hydration and then gradually add more to reach 75%. We've turned the mixer onto the first speed and are waiting for it to combine completely, to form a compact mass and then gradually add more water. Monitoring the temperature is important, so check the dough temperature 3 to 4 times. If you see that the dough is too warm, add more ice to the water and remove the same amount of water from it. Wait for the dough to absorb the water we've added. When it absorbs all of the water, add the next amount of it. It's crucial to monitor the mix. As soon as it's out of the water, we must react and add the next amount at the right time. When it absorbs the water we just added, we'll check the temperature. Always measure the temperature when the dough absorbs the water to get the actual temperature inside the mixer. Adding more water. We're still mixing at a lower speed the whole time. We'll turn the mixer to a higher speed at the end when we add the salt. And we add the salt when about 180 grams of water is left. Measure the temperature. 17.7 degrees Celsius. Now we have 180 grams of water left, so it's time to add the salt. Add all the remaining water at once, and turn the mixer to a higher speed. We'll check the temperature. Now it's 18.2 degrees Celsius. Time to add the olive oil. Now that we've added the olive oil, stay near the mixer and watch. As soon as it absorbs the olive oil, immediately turn it off. It doesn't even have to absorb it completely. That's it. Turn off the mixer. Let the dough rest in the mixer for 6 to 7 minutes. Then we'll transfer it to an oiled plastic container. Oil the plastic container. Oil the bottom and all sides of the bowl. I use sunflower oil for this, and after oiling the bowl, oil your hands so the dough doesn't stick. Unlike Biga or Poolish, it's not as elastic. We went for 75% hydration. Now cover the bowl and leave it at room temperature for 30 minutes. After 30 minutes, we'll stretch and fold the dough. Let's oil our hands a little so the dough doesn't stick. Let's do this together. Wait for it to come out by itself. I can go first. Take it like this. Stretch it. And fold it over. Now from the side, the third side, the fourth side, turn it completely. Stretch it. And fold it swiftly. And do it again. Tighten the dough a bit more. It's crucial that the gluten doesn't start to tear here. The surface should be nice and smooth, like a balloon. It's better to do this part where there's less oil. There can even be no oil, as the dough will close at the bottom more easily. The oil prevents it from closing. Now, transfer it to the bowl. We see that it's firm, good, and ready. This is exactly what we aimed for. Cover it, and leave it at room temperature for about 20 minutes. Then, transfer it to the fridge. It will spend 20 hours in cold fermentation. Now, we start preparing the Poolish. First, sift the flour. We use type 00 flour. It should have at least 13%, but ideally 14% protein. As we said, sift the flour to incorporate air. An extremely important step. We're making a mix of 3 kilograms. Poolish, unlike Biga, uses higher hydration. It has a 1-to-1 water-flour ratio, meaning 1 liter of water per kilogram of flour. Since it's a 3 kilograms mix, we'll need 3 liters of water. Or, to be more precise, 3 kilograms, because we measure everything on a scale, so we don't measure in milliliters, but in grams. We'll use fresh yeast. Add 9 grams to 3 kilograms of flour. That's 3 grams per kilogram. Use a precision scale because many larger scales measure in 5-gram increments, making it difficult to measure accurately, and accuracy is crucial when it comes to yeast. In summer, when it's warmer, we use less yeast. In winter, we use more and add 4 to 4.5 grams per kilogram. Transfer the yeast to a plastic container. Crumble it a bit. Excellent. Then add the water. We're adding 3 liters of water, or 3 kilograms. Use cold water from the fridge. It's crucial to use cold water so the yeast doesn't start working too quickly. As we said for Poolish, use a 1-to-1 ratio of 1 kilogram of flour and 1 kilogram of water. It's very important to be precise with both the flour and water measurements, especially with the yeast. Now, mix the yeast and water well, and transfer it to the bowl with the flour. Always use cold water, 4 to 6 degrees Celsius. When mixed well, transfer the yeast and water to the bowl with the flour. Once we've added all the water, start mixing. Start carefully so we don't splash everything around. As you can see, it's much softer than Biga. Biga is crumbly, while Poolish is more fluid-like. About the consistency of yogurt. Mix everything until it becomes smoother, without many large lumps. Today, we're working in a professional kitchen. And if you're doing it at home, I suggest you make Poolish. It's easier to mix it by hand than Biga. Since we're in a professional kitchen, we have a mixer, so we can easily make Biga, Poolish, or the direct mix. We'll check if the Poolish is ready. We'll look at the texture. Excellent. That's it. Our Poolish is ready. Now we'll transfer the Poolish to a bowl. We won't oil the bowl like we do with Biga because it's unnecessary. It's soft enough that it will stick anyway. Cover it and let it sit at room temperature for 3 to 4 hours. After 3 to 4 hours, you'll start to see small bubbles appear. That's the moment when we transfer it to the refrigerator for 20 hours of cold fermentation. The biggest secret in dough preparation is timing. If we're transporting the dough, we need to adjust the recipe for those conditions. If we're moving it somewhere, we'll use less yeast and maybe lower the hydration slightly. We can also use a broader trick. Leave the bulk dough in cold fermentation a bit longer, and it will become firmer. This way, it can better withstand transport, for example. It's all about adjusting the recipe to the conditions you're working in. Also, the pizza oven, the mixer, and the refrigerator play a crucial role, so you need to know your equipment before making these decisions. After 4 hours at room temperature, transfer the Poolish to the fridge for 20 hours of cold fermentation. The ideal refrigerator temperature is between 4 and 7 degrees Celsius. We took the Poolish out of the fridge after cold fermentation. Here you can see what the Poolish looks like after 24 hours of fermentation. Now, measure the yeast. Since we have 3 kilos of Poolish here, we'll add an extra 1.1 kilos of flour, meaning we now need a total of 3.3 grams of yeast. But since it's winter time, we'll add a bit more. We're aiming for a final hydration of 73%. Now we measure the salt. We'll use 25 grams per kilogram, and since we have 3 kilograms here and we'll add another 1.1 kilograms, we need 102.5 grams of salt. Next, measure the olive oil at 20 grams per kilogram. So, we need a total of 82 grams of oil. Next, measure the flour. We'll use the finest Italian 00 flour. We need 1 kilos and 100 grams because we want a final hydration of 73%. As we've mentioned several times, always sift the flour. First, we add the Poolish to the mixer. Next, add the flour. Then we add the yeast and turn the mixer on to a slower speed. Now we add the salt. And finally add the olive oil. As soon as the olive oil is absorbed, turn off the mixer. Let it sit in the mixer for 6 to 7 minutes, then transfer it to a plastic oiled bowl. Oil the bowl well, then take the dough out of the mixer. Cover the bowl and let it sit at room temperature for 30 minutes. After 30 minutes, we stretch and fold the dough. Turn it over, grab it here, stretch it, and fold it swiftly. And let it rest for another 20 minutes before putting it in the fridge. Now we'll prepare the biga. The first and most important thing is choosing the flour. We will use the finest Italian 00 flour that has 14% protein. This means the flour is quite strong, making it suitable for both indirect and direct dough making. Now my colleague Strahina is sifting the flour to incorporate oxygen into it. This will give us a higher quality dough. The next important step is the yeast. Depending on the market, there are various yeast producers. My advice is to try different yeasts and see which one works best for you, whether it's faster or slower. If you use a faster yeast, you'll keep it at room temperature for a shorter time before transferring it to cold fermentation. If you use a slower yeast, you'll let it sit at room temperature longer before moving it to the fridge. It's also important to know that if you use a stronger or faster yeast, the final dough temperature is a bit lower so we can control it more easily.
Biga is prepared with 45% hydration relative to the flour. We measured 3 kilos of flour, so we now measure 450 milligrams of water per kilogram of flour, which totals 1,350 milligrams of water.
We begin preparing the biga by evenly distributing the flour in the bowl. Then take the yeast. Remember, we're using fresh, finely grated yeast, and mix it in so that it's well broken down. Do not dissolve the yeast in water because we don't want to let it spread evenly throughout the dough. We actually want it to work only in certain areas. Give the yeast a little shake so that it falls to the bottom. Then pour in cold water from the fridge at 4 degrees Celsius. Pour all the water in at once. Then start mixing. First, shake the bowl well so that the flour comes to the surface. Once it's on the surface, we begin mixing by hand. See, the flour gradually starts rising from the bottom. A little more, and then we'll continue mixing by hand. Great. Now we can start mixing by hand. Begin with the drier parts. We won't start in the middle, where the water is, because then too much dough will stick to our hands and form large clumps, which we don't want. We want the dough to be fine and airy. The process of preparing biga is very important, and we must follow every step to get a top-quality product in the end. As mentioned, for making biga, use strong flour so that the dough can withstand all the fermentation. This is how it should look, fine. Mix until every grain of flour is in contact with water. You can notice this by the color. It starts white, and when it turns slightly yellowish, the dough is done. It's very important to scrape all the flour from the bottom, cleaning out all the corners and sides of the bowl. Many chefs prepare biga in a mixer, but my advice is to do it by hand, as it produces much better results. Because this way, the gluten doesn't develop too much, and we end up with a much higher quality product. The pizza melts in your mouth when you eat it. Now, slowly start lifting the dough, letting it flow through the fingers. Don't squeeze it so that the gluten doesn't develop too much. We want it to remain airy. As we said, every grain must come in contact with water. Just a little more and the preparation of our biga will be finished. One sign that the biga isn't ready yet is if you feel dry flour under your fingers. It shouldn't feel dry. I think the biga is ready. Can I take a look? Fantastic. My colleague Strahina has made perfect biga. This is how it should look, airy and smooth, with no big clumps, and just the right gluten development. Now it's time to oil the bowl and transfer our biga into it. We use edible sunflower oil instead of olive oil because the biga will sit in the fridge for about 20 hours, and olive oil can solidify like fat in the fridge, which we want to avoid. Don't press the biga, we just gently transfer it into the bowl. Another important detail is that the biga should not be too thin, so we must choose a bowl that's appropriate for the amount of flour we're using. Here, we have biga made from 3 kg of flour, and we're using a 10-liter bowl. This bowl is just right for achieving the proper thickness. It shouldn't be too thin or too thick, roughly between 10 and 25 centimeters. Now we gently press down on the top. Cover the biga and let it sit at room temperature. If it's summer, we keep the biga at room temperature for 3 to 4 hours and then transfer it to cold fermentation for 24 hours. 20 to 24 hours. If it's winter, we leave the biga at room temperature a bit longer, 6 to 7 hours, and then transfer it to the fridge, where 18 hours of cold fermentation is sufficient. After 4 hours, it's time to move the biga to the fridge. How do we know it's ready for cold fermentation? When the larger pieces start to swell, that's the signal to transfer it to the fridge. After cold fermentation, take the biga out of the fridge. This is what the biga should look like after 24 hours of fermentation. Separate the biga using a plastic spatula. We separate the biga from the edges of the bowl and then turn it out onto a plastic board. Now we will cut the biga. As we said, we deliberately did not dissolve the yeast in water because that would make it work everywhere. Here you can see that it only worked in certain spots, where these little air pockets are. We'll work with 73% hydration, which means we need 730 grams of water per kilogram of flour. For 3 kilo, that totals 2,190 grams of water. But the required amount of water is 2,190 grams minus what we already poured into the biga, 1,350 grams. So we now need 840 grams of water. Mix the water with ice. It must be mixed well to chill the water. We won't pour all the water in at once. Instead, we'll start with 58%. That is, we calculate 3 times 580 grams, which is 1,140 grams, minus what we already have, 1,350 grams. So we need 390 grams of water. Out of the 840 grams, set aside the excess and leave 390 grams in this large container. We'll first pour that into the mixer. Add yeast at 1 gram per kilogram of flour, 3 grams in our case. Now measure the salt. We need 25 grams per kilogram, which means 75 grams for 3 kilos. For olive oil, we need 20 grams per kilogram, so for 3 kilo that's 60 grams. Use extra virgin olive oil. Now that we've measured everything, put the Biga in the mixer and add the yeast and water up to 58%. We will add the remaining water gradually. Pour the Biga in the mixer. We've previously cut it into cubes. Next, add the yeast and pour in the 390 grams of water. That makes up 58% of the water in the mixer. We'll gradually add the remaining water. Then turn the mixer on to a slower speed. The rest of the water must be added gradually, little by little, while regularly checking the temperature. Now we can add the remaining water. If the dough gets stuck, we can quickly switch the mixer to run faster to help it come together. And as soon as it comes together, we switch back to a slower speed. We'll check the temperature. Now, first wet your hands a bit so the dough won't stick. Since the gluten is so strong, the dough rises and sticks to the spiral, so we'll need to pull it out of the spiral 1, 2, or even 3 times during mixing to ensure it mixes evenly. It's important to completely clean the spiral by removing all the dough. We'll mix it by hand and rotate it a little bit. You'll see that when we restart the mixer, because of the strong gluten, it will immediately stick back to a spiral. Now you can see that the bowl immediately pulls the dough upward in a spiral. Now check the dough's temperature. It's 16.6 degrees Celsius. We'll pull the dough out of the spiral once more. We need to pull the dough down so that it's evenly mixed. You'll notice when we take the dough out of the mixer that it's much more elastic than direct mixing. Check the temperature again. Let's pull the dough out of the spiral. It's important to completely release the spiral so the dough doesn't immediately get pulled back up. We then add the salt and pour all the remaining water over it. Then, turn the mixer on to a faster speed. We mix on a faster speed until the dough becomes compact and forms a cohesive mass. We'll wait a few more rounds and then add the olive oil. Now, once it's well combined and has gone through a few more rounds, pour in the olive oil. As soon as it absorbs the olive oil, turn off the mixer. We let the dough rest in the mixer for 6 to 7 minutes, then transfer it into an oiled plastic container. Oil the plastic container using sunflower oil and make sure to coat it well. We've taken the dough out of the mixer and now let it sit at room temperature for 30 minutes. After that, we'll stretch and fold the dough. Can I go first? Let's stretch it out. and fold it. We work on the third side, stretch and fold, and do the same for the fourth side. We turn it, grab it here, stretch it, and fold it. We'll repeat this one more time. Now, where there is less oil on the surface, we tighten it a bit more. That's almost enough. That's it. Transfer it to the bowl. It looks great. Cover it and let it sit at room temperature for 20 minutes. Then put it in the fridge for 2 hours before balling. We'll dust the work surface with flour and sprinkle it. Place the dough on the peel, flip it, and it will slide off on its own. We cut it into 300-gram pieces. Roll one side, then the other. Roll it up, shake off any excess flour, and seal it. It's very important to tighten the dough ball well, and then it's ready. Place it in the tray. For all three types of dough, direct, Biga, and Poolish, the balling procedure is the same. Just be sure that the dough ball is properly sealed. If you use a standard 60x40 tray, you can fit 15 pieces arranged in a 3x5 pattern. If you have a smaller tray, it's important to leave space between the dough balls. When they start to touch each other, that's when we transfer them to the fridge. Put on the lid and leave them at room temperature for about 20 minutes. Then we transfer them to the fridge. After 4 to 6 hours, the dough will be ready. After 15 minutes at room temperature, it has started to come together nicely. Now we'll cover them and put them in the fridge for cold fermentation. After 4 to 6 hours, we'll be able to use this dough. Place it in the fridge. Now we're going to make some pizza. The three most important ingredients are the flour, the tomato sauce or Pelati, and the mozzarella. And they must all be of high quality if you want high quality pizza. You can use Divella tomato sauce or San Marzano tomato sauce for great results. I use San Marzano on its own. I don't need to add any sugar, but with Divella, I add a little to balance the acidity. Many home cooks and local restaurants make the mistake of using tomato puree, which is a big error. You must use tomato sauce, Pelati, for a good, high-quality pizza. In a 2.5 kilogram can, add 2 tablespoons of sugar, 1 tablespoon of salt, 3 to 5 grams of pepper, and 6-7 basil leaves. Blend the tomato sauce until it's completely smooth. Although Italians prefer to crush it by hand and then spread it on the pizza, we've chosen this method, which is more popular here in the Balkans, completely smooth, without any chunks of tomato. We're using dough made with Biga, and we'll start by making a classic capricciosa. This is our dough with 73% hydration. We'll stretch the pizza on semolina and spalvarina, a mix where the semolina is a bit coarser and the spalvarina is finer, which creates the perfect flour blend for stretching. We've worked air into the edges, and now we begin to stretch the dough. Be careful not to press down on the edges. Shake off any excess flour. Dust the work surface with a little flour so the pizza doesn't stick. Stretch it out to about 28 centimeters, and later, after adding the toppings, we stretch it further on the peel to 32 centimeters. Besides the flour and tomato sauce, mozzarella is the third crucial ingredient for pizza, and you shouldn't skimp on quality. I love using dehydrated Fiordi latte mozzarella because it melts beautifully and doesn't burn during baking. We use about 120 grams of mozzarella, which is standard for a 32 centimeter pizza. Add 70 grams of ham and 70 grams of mushrooms. And the pizza is ready to go into the oven. We bake the pizza at 480 degrees Celsius on a biscotto surface. Two usual types of surfaces are fire clay and biscotto. In this oven, we use biscotto stone. The difference between fire clay and biscotto lies in how they transfer heat. On fire clay, the pizza burns on the bottom over 370-380 degrees Celsius after just 30 seconds. But with biscotto, it won't burn even at 500 degrees Celsius. We check the pizza and, if necessary, rotate it. It's very important to return it to the same spot where it was, because if we move it, the bottom may burn. Just a few more seconds and it's done. After baking, drizzle olive oil on the edges. To me, it looks fantastic so far. What do you think?
I agree. It's a beautiful slice and the dough is airy.
This is fantastic. Are you satisfied?
Yes, I am.
Shall we taste what you made? Sure, let's see how it tastes. Honestly, I think this is excellent. Perfect. Maybe it could use a bit more color here. What do you think? This side baked for about 10 seconds longer and got the perfect color.
Yes, if baked perhaps 7 to 8 seconds more would be perfect.
This one might need about 10 more seconds of baking to match this side. This side has the ideal color, perfect crust, fantastic flavor. Truly, this is exactly how it should be.
It melts in your mouth.
What will you make now?
Now we're making a pizza with bresaola. We'll add tomato sauce, cheese, red onion, and later we'll add some bresaola.
We always handle the dough carefully so as not to damage the next dough ball. Flip it over, so the part that was on top now comes down onto the floured surface. Then we start stretching it out. If there's any excess, remove it. Depending on whether you prefer a larger or smaller crust, adjust by pressing your fingers closer to the edge. If you want a smaller crust, press your fingers closer to the edge.
I prefer a larger crust.
It's very important that when stretching the dough, don't press the edges, because then they won't rise nicely and won't be airy. Sprinkle a little flour on the work surface. As mentioned, we use Fior latte, dehydrated mozzarella. If you prefer, you can also use fresh mozzarella, about 125 grams. Then we add red onion. This one's baked just right. What do you think?
We've improved the impression compared to the last pizza.
Perhaps add some arugula? Here, before baking, we put on the tomato sauce, mozzarella, and red onion. And after baking, we added arugula and beef prosciutto called bresaola. Prosciutto should never be baked. We always add it after baking. Whether it's beef or pork prosciutto, it must be added post-baking. For example, if we use pepperoni, we can add it either before or after, depending on the type. What do you think? Can we add one more detail? Maybe a little extra drizzle.
Yes, that would make it even juicier.
Are we going to try it?
Great, I can't wait any longer.
Come on, you go first. You made it, but be honest. Don't say it's excellent just because you made it. Honestly, what do you think?
If I say anything other than, it's excellent, it would be a lie.
Honestly, I can't find a single fault. It's truly top-notch. There was a comment on that other pizza about the baking. It needed a bit more time, but this one is perfect. This is exactly how it should be. In the competitions I judge, a pizza is valued when it's baked like this, not pale, but with a beautiful color.
When baked this way, it's both crispy and soft at the same time.
Truly, this is perfect. And the dough melts in your mouth. One note, it's very important to have a proper flame. Embers alone aren't enough. We can't bake a good pizza without a real fire. I always use beechwood. Clean the oven and check the temperature. It's 463 degrees Celsius. We'll sprinkle some coarse sea salt so that the pizza doesn't burn on the bottom, since the temperature is very high. Here, unlike an oven with biscotto, the pizza would burn on the bottom because of fire clay. That's why we added some salt. First, we'll bake the direct dough with 75% hydration. This is our Biga. The Biga is phenomenal. Now we move on to the Poolish. Excellent. It's phenomenal, just like the Biga. See how the dough comes back after pressing? This is very important. Now we're moving on to direct dough. You can feel the difference when you touch the dough. Direct, Poolish, and Biga. In my opinion, Biga gives the best results. The dough has a beautiful structure and is wonderfully stretched. The edge should have a sharp, defined transition like this. Let's try the Biga first. I have the highest expectations for Biga. The dough literally melts in your mouth.
It's so light you don't have to chew.
It melts in your mouth. Since the Biga dough stood out longer, it has risen a bit more, which is why you see some bubbles forming.
If we had baked it maybe half an hour earlier, it would have been even better.
Fantastic.
Let's see our Poolish now. Less intense flavor than Biga.
Here's a less intense flavor, milder with a bit more chew. Definitely Biga is better than Poolish.
And now, finally, let's try the direct dough.
You can already feel the difference.
It's heavier.
It also has more chew compared to Poolish. It's a bit more bread-like. The Poolish gives a smoother color, while Biga creates little specks. They look similar, direct dough and Biga. But you can feel the difference by touch. And the Poolish is visually distinct, with a different structure and the mildest flavor. Biga, on the other hand, has a more pronounced note, almost tangy but not sour. Overall, Biga has a much more intense and distinct flavor. What would you rank as first, second, and third?
I'd put Biga in first place. I think Poolish is better than direct dough for me.
Number 1 is Biga, with Poolish coming in second, and direct dough takes the third place due to the extra heaviness and chewiness.